Today, we'll be exploring the story of Ricardo Caputo. Ricardo Silvio Caputo was born in 1949 in Mendoza, the capital city of the Argentine province sharing the same name. While his exact birth date is not documented, we know he was the second of three children. He had an older brother, Alberto, and a younger sister, Alicia, though the precise age gaps between them remain unclear. What is well documented, however, is that his parents' marriage was far from harmonious. During Ricardo's early childhood, he was affectionately called Cato. His parents separated. Following the breakup, he lived with his mother and siblings at 1400 Salta Street, where he spent the remainder of his childhood and adolescence. These formative years were reportedly very difficult. According to later accounts from his older brother Alberto, after he moved out of their mother's home, she became increasingly neglectful toward the younger children, particularly Ricardo. Alberto described the environment as deeply unhealthy and emotionally damaging. The situation deteriorated further when their mother began a new relationship, during which Ricardo felt ignored and unsupported by both adults in the household. These experiences had a significant emotional impact on him. As a teenager, Ricardo reportedly struggled with depressive symptoms and began seeking ways to provide for himself, both for basic needs like food and, at times, for more superficial desires such as fashionable clothing. Being too young for formal employment, he turned to informal and unsafe ways of survival, which further affected his mental well-being. Eventually, he dropped out of school. Despite the turmoil he endured, Ricardo maintained a charismatic and easygoing public persona. In the late 1960s, when he was around 16 or 17, those around him were unaware of his hardships. He was popular among his peers and known for charming not only girls his age but also older women. His relationships, even with women from affluent backgrounds, earned him admiration from his friends, which he seemed to enjoy. He often offered them advice on romantic matters, creating the illusion of a life others envied. But this image would not last long. According to some sources, before relocating to New York, Ricardo voluntarily admitted himself to a psychiatric hospital due to his worsening emotional state. While there, he claimed to have received a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder from a psychiatrist named Fernando Linares. However, no official treatment plan or medical documentation has been made public. What is confirmed is that, shortly afterward, at the age of 19, Ricardo left for the United States. He was presented with an opportunity to travel to New York, and although he only had a tourist visa, he ended up staying for a year. During that time, he worked low-paying jobs that just barely allowed him to afford a modest room in a rundown boarding house. His ultimate goal was to remain in North America. However, during the 1970s in Argentina, military service was still mandatory, and failing to report could lead to serious consequences. So, when he was called up, he had no choice but to return to Mendoza, where he completed his military service in the 4th Army Brigade. But Ricardo's ambitions hadn't changed. As soon as he was discharged, at the age of 22, he returned to New York, this time to settle permanently. He came back in 1971, now with proper documentation, which made it easier for him to find work, though surviving in the city still required him to juggle two jobs. By day, he was employed at the luxurious Plaza Hotel overlooking Central Park. By night, he worked as a doorman at a women-only hotel called the Barbizon. It was during that same year that he met his first known victim. Natalie Brown was 3 years younger than him and a U.S. native. She was outgoing, kind-hearted, and full of life. Although she had been in several previous relationships, she often felt that no one, neither her former partners nor her parents, truly took her seriously. At that point in her life, what she longed for most was a meaningful relationship built on emotional connection, not just physical attraction. According to accounts, this aligned with what Ricardo claimed to want as well. He presented himself as someone genuinely interested in a committed relationship, a claim we now know was far from the truth, though Natalie could not have known that at the time. At 19, she worked as a bank teller at the very branch where Ricardo cashed his paychecks. Their meeting was entirely coincidental. Despite his limited English, Ricardo's charm and physical appeal seemed to transcend the language barrier. He managed to ask her out, and she agreed. That same day, Ricardo waited for her outside work, and they went out for drinks. What seemed to be the beginning of a beautiful romance was, for a while, exactly that, at least in Ricardo's eyes. He quickly became infatuated, and they spent nearly all their free time together. He was convinced that Natalie was the love of his life. 3 months into the relationship, the couple decided to take a vacation together to Costa Rica and the Virgin Islands. However, by that time, Natalie had begun to change. The brightness she once carried seemed to fade, and those close to her noticed the shift in her demeanor. Still, after the trip, neither of them wanted to end their holiday. Ricardo expressed a desire to visit Florida and California, and Natalie agreed to accompany him. Eventually, he persuaded her to rent an apartment in San Francisco, even though he arrived there with little more than a backpack and a few items of clothing. He had to ask his parents to send more clothes just to get by. While Natalie's parents were emotionally supportive, they did not provide her with financial assistance for living in San Francisco. This made sustaining her new life there increasingly difficult. Not long afterward, she returned to her hometown to live with her family. Upon her return, Ricardo became increasingly insistent. He wanted to marry her as soon as possible. His visa had expired, and marriage could have provided a solution. While Natalie didn't appear truly committed to the idea, she reluctantly began the process, even signing some paperwork. However, Natalie didn't mention anything to anyone, not to her parents, not to her friends. It became increasingly clear that she had no genuine intention of getting married. Over time, she began confiding in friends about her growing concerns regarding the relationship. She described Ricardo as possessive and overly jealous, saying he became upset when other men were around her. Eventually, after several months, she had had enough. Natalie began telling those close to her that she planned to end the relationship. What happened next is known only through Ricardo Caputo's later confession, details that, understandably, may not be entirely truthful. According to his account, the two were alone at Natalie's parents' home when the situation escalated. Ricardo claimed that he had followed her to her room to be intimate, but she rejected his advances. While the exact reason remains unknown, testimony suggests that she may have been attempting to initiate a conversation about ending the relationship. Ricardo, however, claimed that she told him she had been unfaithful. Natalie then tried to distance herself from him and ran toward the front of the house, where the argument continued. She then entered the kitchen. In a fit of rage, Ricardo took hold of a knife from the table. Using his free hand to restrain her, he assaulted her, causing serious injuries. Despite being severely wounded, Natalie was reportedly still alive. Ricardo later confessed that he didn't just want to hurt her, he wanted to ensure she wouldn't survive. He stated that he proceeded to strangle her until she stopped moving. Once he realized she was no longer alive, he stood up and, with an unsettling calmness, called 911. "I just killed my girlfriend," he said. He was arrested that same night. What initially appeared to be a straightforward case soon grew more complicated. As part of the investigation, Ricardo underwent several psychological evaluations by different mental health professionals. Each of them concluded that he was suffering from a serious mental illness, possibly schizophrenia. Because of this, the court declared him not criminally responsible. Instead of being sentenced to prison, he was committed to the Vion Psychiatric Hospital, where he remained until 1973. During his time in treatment, Ricardo continued to speak of Natalie, and even her father, as though they were still alive. He claimed she visited him regularly and would help him recover. These delusional statements led doctors to believe he was exhibiting signs consistent with schizophrenia. However, after some time in treatment, Ricardo's behavior began to shift. He stopped talking about those imagined encounters. Over time, Ricardo's interactions with psychiatrists began to change. His behavior shifted, he no longer referenced deceased individuals, and his demeanor during evaluations became noticeably different. Observations started to describe him as increasingly demanding and manipulative. Had he been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, he likely would not have been placed in a psychiatric hospital, which raised suspicions that he may have been feigning symptoms. Nonetheless, further evaluations were conducted, and the medical team continued to favor treatment over incarceration. While institutionalized, Ricardo participated in a rehabilitation program that encouraged patients to engage in artistic or manual work that could help them earn money upon release. In his case, he used his drawing skills to create sketches, which he sold for a modest income. However, the most consequential aspect of his time at Diakon Hospital was not his art. It was his relationship with Judith Becker, his second known victim. Judith was not a fellow patient, she was a 26-year-old psychologist and one of the professionals assigned to his care. While most of Ricardo's attending physicians described him in clinical reports as manipulative and emotionally calculating, Judith's evaluations were significantly more optimistic. She noted signs of improvement, and her favorable assessments played a direct role in granting Ricardo privileges such as being transferred to a lower security facility and receiving temporary leaves from the hospital. What no one expected was that, during one of these supervised outings, Ricardo would take Judith's life. The first time Ricardo was granted a temporary release was at Judith's request. She believed his behavior at the new hospital had been exemplary. With permission, she took him out for dinner and a movie. Their relationship, by this point, had evolved from professional to personal. They were no longer just doctor and patient. They had become friends and eventually lovers. Judith used his leave periods to introduce him to her new apartment, take him out to dinner, and engage in activities typically shared by couples. Ricardo later offered an account of their relationship that raised skepticism. He claimed he had grown concerned about Judith's preferences, alleging that she engaged in intimate behaviors that he found unsettling and that she encouraged him to act aggressively, something he said made him uncomfortable. According to him, he even brought up these concerns with one of his psychiatrists, who supposedly advised him to distance himself from her. However, there is no official record of such a conversation ever taking place. While it's possible the relationship was as Ricardo described, it's difficult to believe a man with a long history of manipulation, particularly regarding his partners. It is equally plausible that his account was a projection, reflecting his tendencies rather than hers. As time went on, Ricardo became increasingly possessive. On several occasions, he left the hospital without permission to visit Judith's apartment unannounced, often interrupting her plans with others. These intrusions frequently escalated into heated arguments. However, he wanted their relationship to move beyond something casual and become more serious, so he began pressuring Judith to introduce him to her friends and family. Though hesitant at first, the psychologist eventually gave in to his demands. During one of Caputo's temporary releases, she introduced him to her parents, but instead of telling them he was one of her patients, she claimed he was a coworker. This infuriated him. He became convinced that Judith didn't truly care for him and was ashamed of him, though he never expressed these feelings openly. It's also important to note that by this time, Judith already wanted to end the relationship. The only reason she introduced him to her family was due to his relentless insistence. She had already confided in others that she intended to break things off as soon as possible. But imagine how difficult that is when the person you're trying to leave keeps showing up uninvited at your doorstep. It's not easy to sever ties with someone so unpredictable. Ricardo was charming. He acted like a perfect gentleman in front of Judith's family, leaving them with no reason to be concerned. But Judith was exhausted and pregnant. That night, instead of returning to their shared apartment together, she dropped him off at the train station and went back to her parents' home. Not long after, she underwent an abortion. Days later, she finally decided to tell Ricardo that she no longer wanted to see him, that she was in a relationship with someone else, and that this new partner was a police officer. But Ricardo refused to accept it. He kept visiting her home, completely ignoring the fact that their relationship was over. And time went on like this, until, in October, he suddenly stopped. He no longer showed up at her door or appeared unannounced. It seemed as if Ricardo had finally moved on. Or at least, that's what Judith believed. Everything remained quiet until October 18, 1974. That day, Ricardo began his day by going to the bank, where he withdrew $1,500, his entire savings. He then called Judith to apologize, saying he wanted to make amends for all the pain he had caused her. She agreed to meet him. Judith told her parents that she would be going boating with her friend, Richie, as she affectionately called Ricardo Caputo. But when he arrived, Ricardo said he didn't feel like going out and suggested they stay in her apartment instead. Judith agreed. They spent some time together, and she even offered to cook dinner. However, during the meal, he began yelling at her. It's unclear what sparked the argument, what plans he might have revealed, or what words were exchanged. What we do know is that the situation escalated rapidly. According to neighbors, the shouting match lasted several minutes and was followed by the sounds of violent blows, until, suddenly, everything went silent. Inside the apartment, Ricardo had struck Judith so violently that he broke her nose, but even that was not enough for him. Enraged, Caputo grabbed one of Judith's nylon stockings and used it to strangle her. While the neighbors couldn't have known exactly what was happening, the argument they had overheard was so intense that they decided to call 911. When the police arrived and rang the doorbell, no one answered. They forced entry and found Judith's naked body lying on the bed. There was no trace of Ricardo. He had taken all the cash in the apartment, along with the psychologist's purse, and fled to the nearest bus station. Less than an hour after committing his second murder, Ricardo boarded a bus bound for San Francisco, arriving after a grueling 3-day journey. Aware that authorities would soon launch a search for him, he resolved to reinvent himself upon arrival. He started with the basics, cutting his hair, shaving off his mustache, and setting a goal to gain weight to alter his appearance. With the money he had, he purchased a forged identity on the black market. His new documents identified him as Ricardo Donoguer, a Uruguayan rather than an Argentine. This would be the first of at least 17 false identities he would adopt over the following years to evade the FBI. One of the most effective ways to avoid detection and prevent his false identity from being exposed was to avoid formal employment. Instead of working under official records, Ricardo continued to rely on his artistic talents, selling sketches and portraits to tourists on the street. The income wasn't substantial, but it was enough to afford a room in a boarding house and occasionally enjoy a drink at a bar. It was during one of these outings that he encountered his third victim. In November 1974, while having a drink at a bar, Ricardo met Barbara Taylor, a woman roughly the same age as Judith. Barbara was known for her strong independence, outgoing personality, and striking beauty, qualities that immediately caught Caputo's attention. Taking advantage of having his drawing materials with him, he offered to sketch her portrait. Rather than trying to sell it, he approached her and gave it as a gift. This simple act sparked a conversation between them, and using his signature charm, Ricardo asked Barbara if they could have dinner in the coming days. She agreed. As with his previous victims, the early stages of the relationship were seemingly idyllic. They saw each other nearly every day, and after several weeks of dating, Barbara even invited Ricardo to move in with her and leave the boarding house behind. However, this honeymoon phase would not last long. By December, feeling increasingly suffocated in the relationship, Barbara decided to help her boyfriend find a job in Hawaii. She even contributed financially to cover his travel expenses to Honolulu when he secured employment at a bar. The plan to create some distance from Barbara initially seemed effective, but it would not last long. In March 1975, Ricardo returned to San Francisco unannounced, loudly declaring that he was back and wanted to marry her. He never disclosed the real reason for his sudden return. He had attempted to murder another woman in Honolulu. The victim was Mary O'Neill, a tourist vacationing in Hawaii, whom Caputo had approached and persuaded to invite him to her accommodation. Once there, he violently assaulted her with the intent to kill. However, just before he could execute his plan, Mary's travel companion returned and intervened, saving her life. Ricardo fled the scene and immediately returned to San Francisco, never telling Barbara what had transpired. Despite this, they continued their relationship for roughly another year. Until April 1976, when Barbara's patience finally ran out. By then, it appeared he had already begun physically abusing her, and their relationship was marked more by turmoil than affection. She decided to leave him, a decision Ricardo did not take well. He murdered Barbara on Good Friday, and her body was discovered by the police the next day in a horrifying condition. She had suffered a brutal beating. One of the investigating officers described her condition as follows: her face was disfigured, and her thighs, arms, and hands were covered in bruises caused by repeated blows from a leg wearing the same Texan boots her boyfriend had gifted her. The kicks to the back of her neck were so severe that the skin had split open, exposing the bone. Naturally, Barbara's boyfriend became the prime suspect. The police quickly identified him and began circulating his photo. But Ricardo had already fled the country. He escaped to Mexico, where he assumed a new identity, Ricardo Martinez Diaz. He settled in Mexico City under this alias. Just 4 days after Barbara Taylor's murder, Caputo attempted to cross the border illegally from El Paso, Texas, into Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, via a bridge over the Rio Grande. Initially, he claimed to be a Mexican national returning home. However, the Mexican border agents, suspicious of his Argentine accent, pressed him further. He then changed his story, admitting he was South American and had stowed away on an Argentine ship that docked in Florida. The Mexican guards handed him over to U.S. authorities, who placed him in a detention center in El Paso. There, 2 FBI agents interrogated him and took his fingerprints. They could have apprehended him at that very moment. 2 crucial factors played in his favor: the slow fingerprint matching processes of the mid-1970s and Caputo's swift adaptability. During his interrogation, Ricardo learned a critical detail. Stowaways were under FBI jurisdiction, but deserters were not. He quickly altered his account, claiming he was not a stowaway but a deserter. As a result, the FBI agents had no choice but to hand him over to immigration authorities. This allowed Ricardo to request time to find legal representation, and the agents left, promising to return in a week. 4 nights later, Ricardo and 3 other detainees overpowered an unarmed guard in the men's dormitory of the El Paso detention center. They took him hostage, demanding his keys and the intercom device. The guard hesitated, but Ricardo had fashioned a makeshift knife from a bed frame and slashed the man's neck, leaving an 8-centimeter wound. The guard, now with no choice, complied. The group then made their way to the detention center's kitchen, armed with knives and a butcher's axe. Under duress, the guard was forced to use the intercom to inform the outer guards that he was being held hostage. Ricardo demanded the electric gate be opened and warned them not to delay. He had nothing to lose. Complying under pressure and fearing for the hostage's life, the guards opened the doors. Ricardo and his accomplices stormed out, locking the guard and others inside. They stole money and weapons, then escaped in a stolen vehicle, one of them dressed in a guard's uniform, and successfully crossed the border into Juarez. Though his accomplices were arrested soon after, Ricardo managed to catch a train to Mexico City, where he began a new chapter of his fugitive life. By that time, the American press had dubbed him the Lady Killer, and he had become one of the FBI's most wanted criminals. Despite intense efforts by authorities, Caputo had no trouble establishing a new identity. While living in Mexico City, he met 23-year-old Laura Gomez, the daughter of a powerful transportation magnate. Smitten, Laura persuaded her father to offer Ricardo a job, and Caputo was soon managing one of his future father-in-law's companies in Polanco. Their relationship appeared far more stable than any of his previous ones, and Laura fell deeply in love. However, by June 1977, Caputo began hearing voices once again and ultimately murdered Laura as well. Unlike the killings of Judith and Natalie, this confrontation was sparked by Laura's persistent desire to marry. She had recently discovered she was pregnant but chose not to tell Ricardo. Instead, she pushed harder for marriage, something Ricardo vehemently rejected. Though he had long pretended to be open to marriage, he feared that doing so would expose his true identity. Unable to explain this, the argument escalated until, according to him, the voices returned. The voices, according to him, instructed him to kill Laura. He seized an iron bar and struck her in the head more than 10 times, ending her life. The blows were delivered with such ferocity that her skull was crushed, and 2 of her teeth were dislodged. Remarkably, Ricardo managed to escape once again. He operated with such impunity and had such a remarkable talent for reinventing himself that, despite being one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives, Caputo returned to the United States and settled in Los Angeles under the alias Roberto Dominguez. Assuming this new identity, Caputo built a seemingly ordinary life. He married a woman named Felicia, with whom he had 2 children. However, this semblance of domestic bliss came to a sudden end in 1984 when Felicia mysteriously disappeared. Despite the proximity of law enforcement, Roberto Dominguez fully cooperated with the investigation and successfully avoided detection. To this day, it remains unclear whether Felicia's disappearance was Caputo's doing, though many believe he may have grown tired of her or simply desired to reinvent his life once more. Following this incident, Roberto left his children in the care of Felicia's family and moved to Chicago, where he started over yet again. There, he married for a second time, this time to Susana Elizondo, with whom he had 4 more children. All the while, he remained a fugitive, evading the FBI and living under an assumed identity while active investigations continued. His marriage to Susana appeared to be ideal. She later described him as an exemplary husband and father. Their life together continued until 1994, when Ricardo explained that he needed to return urgently to Argentina. He traveled directly to Mendoza to reunite with his mother, whom he had not seen in over 20 years. In the kitchen of the very home where he had grown up, Ricardo confessed everything to her. He told her, "I've started hearing the voices again, Mom. They're telling me to kill." He added, "I killed 4 women in the United States, and I've been on the run for 21 years. I want to turn myself in." His mother begged him not to surrender just yet. Instead, she contacted a local attorney named Mario Elquez and psychiatrist Dr. Linners, who had treated Ricardo during his adolescence. Armed with decades-old records, Dr. Linners interviewed him once again and reaffirmed his diagnosis of schizophrenia to assist in Ricardo's future legal defense. Attorney Elquez, in turn, reached out to Michael Kennedy, one of New York's most prestigious and expensive attorneys. Given that Kennedy's fees were far beyond what Ricardo could afford, he was advised to sell his story to the media before surrendering. Ricardo eventually negotiated with several media outlets and secured a $100,000 payment from ABC for an exclusive interview conducted by journalist Chris Wallace. During the televised segment, Wallace directly asked whether he had murdered Natalie, Judith, Barbara, and Laura. Caputo simply replied, "Yes." When asked why, he stated, "I think it goes back to my childhood. I was mentally ill." He was finally arrested on March 9, 1994. After 2 decades, one of the most elusive and notorious serial killers of recent times had been captured. Unlike other serial killer cases, relatively little is known about his trial. Although it received considerable media attention at the time, there is now a noticeable lack of detailed information regarding the judicial proceedings. What we do know is that Michael Kennedy led the defense team for the Argentine national, basing his strategy on Caputo's mental health. Kennedy emphasized his client's multiple psychiatric hospitalizations and the fact that he had been diagnosed with various mental disorders, beginning with schizophrenia. However, bringing in new medical experts, Kennedy argued that Caputo actually suffered from dissociative identity disorder. This diagnosis was meant to explain how someone so outwardly charismatic could simultaneously be one of the most notorious serial killers of recent decades. Despite Kennedy's reputation as one of the most distinguished attorneys of the time, his arguments failed to sway the jury, which ultimately found Caputo guilty. During the final session of the trial, upon the announcement of the verdict, Caputo exercised his right to speak. In flawless English, he said, "I turned myself in, Your Honor, to prevent further deaths. I want to tell the victims' families that I deeply regret what I've done. I was very sick, and I hope that prison can now heal me." His words, however, elicited no emotion or sympathy from the judge or those present in the courtroom. During that same hearing, the judge handed down the sentence, 25 years in prison, to be served in a facility located in Attica, in northern United States, near the Canadian border. Nonetheless, Caputo would not serve even a fifth of his sentence. In 1998, just 4 years after the trial and at the age of 48, Ricardo Caputo died of a heart attack while playing basketball with fellow inmates. At the time of his death, U.S. authorities had reopened investigations into the man dubbed the Lady Killer, suspecting he may have been responsible for more than the 4 confirmed murders. While this theory was widely accepted, no additional charges were substantiated before his death. Several books have been written about him, the most notable being Love Me to Death by Linda Wolfe, in which Caputo openly shared details about his relationships with the victims and his reasons for killing them. And with that, we conclude today's case. Ricardo Caputo, an Argentine fugitive hunted by the FBI for years. If you have any case suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments. Thanks for watching until the very end. You can subscribe by clicking on the subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.